Some people grow old and simply fade away. Not because they've lost their clarity of mind or their will to live, but because little by little, they've been erased by words left unsaid, by invitations that never came, by decisions made as if their very existence no longer mattered. Have you ever felt that? As if you were becoming invisible, useful only when someone needs the house cared for, food prepared, or children watched. That's exactly how this story begins, with the silence of someone discarded by her own family and the extraordinary courage to turn the tables on her own. What you're about to read is not a story of revenge. It's about rebirth. About that quiet strength we think we've lost but that still beats within us, waiting patiently to be heard. It's about turning abandonment into freedom, rejection into autonomy, pain into legacy. It's about a woman who chose to stop living as a shadow and finally stepped into the spotlight of her own life. Don't expect easy tears. Expect unexpected twists, unlikely encounters, and a journey that began with contempt and ended with respect. You will see yourself in her. You will laugh with her. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize there is still time for your own journey. If you have the courage to keep reading, you might also discover how to become unforgettable even after being forgotten. That morning, everything looked peaceful on the surface, but there was a tension hidden in her son's hurried eyes and in the overly sweet tone of her daughter-in-law's voice. The house was spotless, the table neatly set, and their suitcase already waiting by the door. "Mom, you'll take care of everything, right? I trust you, like always." It was supposed to sound affectionate, but it carried the heavy weight of an old habit, treating the woman who raised generations as the family's official helper. What should have been care had turned into convenience. There she stood, hair tied back, apron on as usual, smiling without even knowing anymore if it was affection or just pure habit. Nobody asked if she wanted to go. Nobody even considered it. As if her life's purpose had expired. Invisible, but functional. The words came with cruel ease. "You're too old for long flights, Grandma." Spoken in that condescending, almost childlike tone, as if she were a delicate porcelain doll too fragile for the world. And that's when something cracked inside her. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about all the years she had been quietly pushed aside. Rejection doesn't shout. It whispers through small gestures. In the plate left untouched. In the chair never pulled out. In the invitation that never arrives. Contempt doesn't need insults to hurt. Sometimes it's delivered with a smile and a thank you for everything before the door clicks shut. She waved, yes. She even smiled. She stood at the curb and watched the car pull away. Their suitcase in the trunk, joy painted across their faces, the perfect vacation plan without her. A piece of the house drove away in that car, but no one noticed that her heart was leaving with it. Not from jealousy or attachment, but from the realization that she had been pushed into the corner of her own life, stripped of choice. Contempt is loneliness disguised as normalcy. And she knew that taste well. For a long time, she had stopped being heard. Now she had stopped being taken along. Literally. They swore they were being considerate. She needs to rest, they said. This will be better for her, less stress. But what they never said out loud was the truth: they didn't want her there. That her presence didn't fit into the glossy photos of exotic vacations. That in their eyes, her time had already expired. Abandonment looks like that: a string of small exclusions that, once added up, become a deafening absence. She didn't cry in that moment. Sometimes courage means not begging for space. It means watching contempt with steady eyes and deciding, silently, that it will not define you. Back inside, the house felt bigger. Empty space echoed between the furniture. Every corner reminded her she hadn't been included again. She had always been the one to brew the coffee, fold the sheets, stay behind. Never the star of the gathering, never the priority. And the cruelest part? She accepted it. Because she had been taught to put others first. To erase herself in the name of family's sake. But there's a limit. And that morning, without speaking a word, she realized she had reached it. For the first time, she felt old, not because of her age, but because of abandonment. Rejection like that doesn't arrive with a fight. It comes as a note on the fridge, "There's food ready." It comes as a tap on the shoulder and a "Can you watch the house for us?" said as casually as asking someone to water the plants. And that's what she had done for decades, watered everyone else's life. But who watered hers? No one. Her solitude was so deep that even the neighbors thought she preferred being alone. But it wasn't preference. It was routine, conformity, invisibility. And that kind of solitude makes you forget yourself. But don't be mistaken. What she carried in her chest wasn't weakness. It was resilience. It was the silent strength of someone who had watched the world flip upside down and survived anyway. She remembered her son's birth, the sleepless nights, the years of carrying grocery bags and still smiling inside. She wasn't pitiful. She was simply tired of being discarded. And that day, something inside her shifted. There were no tears in her eyes, but there was resolve in her steps. Her family's contempt hadn't destroyed her, it had only awakened something that had been asleep for far too long. That night before bed, she sat in the old armchair, the same one where she once rocked her grandson to sleep. She brewed a cup of tea, stared at the closed door, and whispered, "Too old for long flights." She repeated it, not as lament, but as challenge. And in that silence filled with both pain and courage, the first spark of liberation was born. The same woman who had spent decades saying yes to everyone else began to say no to herself. No to abandonment. No to rejection. And that first no would only be the beginning. The next morning, the silence of the house felt heavier. No voices, no hurried footsteps, only the ticking of the clock mocking her waiting. She walked to the gate, as she always did, unhurried, carrying routine on her shoulders. And there, tucked between bills and advertisements, she saw the envelope. Her name scribbled hastily, but still readable. Curious, she opened it. And there they were, the tickets. Athens, round trip. 4 in total. 3 names filled in. Hers left blank. That wasn't a mistake. It was a sentence in silence. The material proof of the exclusion she had already felt in her chest now printed in black and white. No one forgets a grandmother by accident. They forget because they've already decided she doesn't matter. She stood there frozen, trembling hands holding the envelope like it was a grenade ready to explode. Her head spun, her stomach dropped. How could they have left this here? How could they take care of every detail except her? The contempt that had once been only a sensation now had a date, a time, and a destination. There, alone on the sidewalk, she experienced a pain that had no sound. It only pulsed. A rejection so explicit that even anger couldn't come, just an inner silence sharper than any scream. Abandonment isn't explained, it's felt. And that morning, she felt what many women feel but never confess, being forgotten by those they love most. She climbed the stairs slowly, as if each step demanded more strength than her body could give. She sat at the kitchen table, spread out the papers, and stared at them. The letters mocked her. Everything was their destination, dates, hotel. Everything but her name. One small detail that screamed louder than words. She lifted her coffee cup to her lips, but the taste was gone. As if everything she had believed in was collapsing. She didn't want drama. She was never one for scenes. She had always thought dignity lived in silence. But at that moment, she realized there are silences that scream louder than words. And sometimes, staying silent is also a way of resisting. Without telling anyone, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of the travel agent printed on the page. She said little, but she spoke firmly. "I want to cancel all the tickets. All 4. The agent hesitated, asked for confirmation, but she didn't falter. She confirmed, her voice calm and steady. This wasn't revenge. It was choice. For the first time in years, she was choosing for herself. Canceling those tickets was like breaking an invisible chain that had bound her to a secondary role in her own story. She knew there would be consequences. But she also knew she couldn't live off emotional crumbs any longer. When she hung up, she didn't smile. But inside, Something finally took a deep breath for the first time in decades. She ran her hand through her gray hair, as if reminding herself she was still alive, still capable of making choices. The pain didn't disappear. But it gained a new name: freedom. For the first time, that word truly made sense. Freedom isn't noisy. It arrives quietly, through small gestures. And there, between a forgotten coffee cup and 4 cancelled tickets, a new chapter began. One without a script yet, but with a clear direction away from everyone else's shadow. She spent the rest of the day in silence. She walked through the rooms of the house as if they had been rearranged overnight. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. Now, every object told a different story. The old photos, the memories, the furniture she had once chosen, all of it carried new weight. She was no longer the official caregiver. She was a woman standing before an abyss and willing to jump. For the first time, she felt the vertigo of autonomy. It frightened her, yes. But it also lit her up. It was like removing a veil from her eyes and realizing there was still a world waiting on the other side of the door. She sat back down at the table, this time with paper and pen. She wrote her full name, in large letters. Then, underneath, she wrote the name of the city she had always dreamed of visiting: Athens. She didn't need anyone else to make it real. She thought of Paul, the husband who once made her dream. He used to tell her she had the soul of a traveler, even though she had never flown much. "You were born to see the world with your own eyes," he would repeat. And in that moment, as if hearing his voice echo between the walls, she made her decision. No more waiting. No more settling for a supporting role. She stood up slowly, but with a new rhythm in her step. She went to the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and pulled out the old suitcase. It was dusty, of course. But it still had life in it. Just like she did. She began folding clothes carefully. Not many. But she chose one special dress, the red one she had worn only once years ago, and never again. She thought, why keep joy locked in the back of the closet? Why save things for a special occasion that never comes? Now was the occasion. Now was the choice. Each piece of clothing she placed inside was like a layer of pain being replaced by courage. She didn't know exactly what awaited her, but she knew one thing: she would no longer stand still, waiting to be remembered. That night, before bed, she held the picture frame with the old photo of Paul. He was smiling in that way only he could, half shy, half conspiratorial, like someone who always knew more than he let on. She couldn't help but remember everything they had lived together. The promises whispered by the bedside, the talks about the future, the plans that always included traveling and discovering new places. But then came the children, the bills, other people's priorities, and life slowly hardened into routine. Over the years she had taken on so many roles: mother, wife, caregiver, grandmother, nurse, cook, that somewhere along the way, she forgot what it meant to simply be herself. Now, alone in that room, she felt his absence more vividly than ever. And yet, for the first time, courage came alongside the emptiness. She asked herself quietly, what if I went? The question sounded simple, but it carried the weight of years of waiting, of accumulated invisibility, of a life lived for everyone else. She knew that if she didn't do it now, she might never do it. There was something different in the air, like a new season blooming inside her. She thought of the grandchildren, of her son, of her daughter-in-law, and of how they all saw her as someone useful only when convenient. She was tired of being the shadow in a crowded house. Tired of being remembered only when something needed fixing. For the first time in decades, she gave herself permission to think of herself without guilt. And in that instant, she decided she would travel. Not with them. For her. She walked firmly to the computer. She searched for flights, simple packages, modest accommodations. Nothing luxurious. She wasn't chasing comfort, she was chasing freedom. When she found a promotion to Athens, she smiled faintly. It was as if destiny had been quietly waiting for her to arrive at this exact moment. She typed in her information carefully, taking a deep breath before clicking purchase. When she did, a chill ran through her spine. But it was a good chill, the kind that announces change. She told no one. That decision was hers alone. For the first time, she wasn't asking permission, wasn't waiting for approval. She took the risk. And with it came a strange, powerful sensation: autonomy. She made sure to print the ticket. She wanted to touch it, to hold in her hands the concrete proof that she was still capable of choosing. That she still had dreams, desires, will. Holding that piece of paper was like holding a piece of her own freedom. That boarding pass wasn't just for a distant country. It was a passport into a new version of herself. More whole. More present. More alive. The woman who had lived for so long as a supporting character was finally stepping into the lead role. It was a way of being reborn, not into youth, but into truth. The truth that had so often been smothered under obligations, imposed silences, and contempt disguised as care. With the ticket in hand, she walked to the mirror. She studied herself for a moment. Her face bore wrinkles, yes. But it also bore stories. Her skin was marked by time, but her eyes still shone. She was no longer young. But she was far from finished. Life still pulsed there. And maybe that was the greatest secret: realizing that rebirth doesn't depend on age, but on the decision to put yourself at the center of your own story. For the first time, she looked at herself with compassion. And she felt a kind of joy she hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes when you finally choose yourself, even after being overlooked so many times. She placed the ticket in a drawer, alongside a handwritten note: "Don't tell anyone. Go first. Explain later." It was a reminder. A pact with herself. No more justifying her steps. No more asking permission to exist. Pain had taught her that the best changes are born out of silence. Not the silence of submission, but of preparation. The trip hadn't even started yet, but in her mind, in her choices, in every small act of courage, she was already on her way. It was the beginning of something larger: a reunion with her own essence. She spent the following days as if she were dancing in secret. She tied up loose ends, handled what needed handling, made quiet lists. She didn't want to draw attention. She just wanted to make sure everything was ready for the right moment. The world around her remained the same: busy children, distracted grandchildren, an absent daughter-in-law. No one noticed what was happening inside her. And that hurt less than before. Because now she knew her worth no longer depended on anyone's gaze. She was learning to be enough for herself. To build inside her the strength not to turn back. And so, in silence, she prepared. There was no soundtrack, no dramatic music. Only the steady beating of her decision echoing inside her chest. The woman who once waited to be invited was now the one packing the bags. The one choosing the destination. The one daring to dream. And with each step she took toward the unknown, she left behind not only the house but the old version of herself. The one who accepted contempt as normal. The one who confused loneliness with duty. She didn't know what awaited her in Athens. But she knew what she would never carry again. And that, by itself, was already freedom. The suitcase stood there, tucked into the corner of the bedroom like a secret waiting to be revealed. It wasn't large, nor impressive. Inside were only a few clothes, a pair of comfortable shoes, some medicine, a book she had read many times before, and that red dress, the one she had saved for a special occasion that never came. She also placed inside her old passport, the one still stamped with her honeymoon trip with Paul, decades ago. And alongside it, she slid in a black and white photo of the two of them, young, smiling, full of plans. This wasn't just a departure. It was a declaration of freedom. The woman who had always stayed behind was finally choosing to go. And she did so with the quiet firmness of someone who had grown tired of being postponed. On the morning of her trip, she woke before the alarm. Her heart beat differently. Not fear, something else. The thrill of change. The sky was still dark when she locked the front door. No letter, no note. Just the click of the key turning, sealing the end of one chapter. She walked down the sidewalk with light steps, almost floating beneath the shadows of the trees. She ordered a taxi through an app she had secretly learned to use, as if she were relearning how to walk. The driver was young, kind, talkative. She said little. She was lost in her own thoughts, replaying the scenes of the life she was leaving behind. That house. That routine. That imposed role. It was time to write another story. Arriving at the airport after 30 years felt like crossing a portal. Everything was new and familiar at once. The lights, the signs, the announcements in different languages. She gripped the handle of her suitcase tightly, like it was an anchor in open waters. Of course, there was hesitation. But there was also a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been seen in years. Around her, people rushed, young travelers, families on vacation, executives tied to their phones. No one noticed her. Invisible in the crowd. And yet, in that anonymity, she felt free. No one expected anything from her. No one demanded. For the first time in so long, she was simply herself, without labels, without obligations, without a role already written. She passed through security, waited in line, slipped off her shoes, followed every instruction with the patience of a ritual. Each step was proof that she was still capable. That age didn't set her limits. That courage didn't expire. When she sat in the boarding lounge, she observed the people around her. And in the middle of that rush, she smiled inside. Yes, she was invisible. But for the first time, invisibility felt like choice, not punishment. She was choosing to disappear from the eyes that never really saw her to finally find herself. When boarding was called, she rose slowly, without hurry. She presented her ticket with steady hands. She walked down the jet bridge like someone stepping onto sacred ground. As she entered the plane, she drew a deep breath. The sound of the turbines, the narrow rows of seats, the strangers' distracted faces, all of it felt magical. She sat by the window and looked outside. The runway lights twinkled like stars on the ground. As the plane began to accelerate, her heart raced. And when it finally lifted off, a single tear slipped down her cheek. But it wasn't sadness. It was release. For the first time, she was leaving by her own will. Not being left. Not being excluded. During the flight, she pulled out the note she had written for herself: "Go first. Explain later." She smiled. The woman who once swallowed everything in silence was now speaking through action. She no longer needed to prove her worth to anyone. She was learning to recognize it on her own. She looked through the window at the clouds, at the golden tones of the sunrise, at the world shrinking below her. And inside, something expanded. A new strength. A resilience that didn't shout but affirmed itself with sweetness. She felt light, as if leaving behind not just years of abandonment, rejection, and contempt disguised as care, but entire lifetimes of forgetting herself. She wasn't running away. She was going to meet herself. When the plane touched down, the vibration of the ground echoed in her chest. She picked up her suitcase, followed the signs carefully, blending into the crowd. For the first time, no one was waiting for her. No placard with her name, no arms outstretched at arrivals. But there were no expectations either. And that was freedom. She walked through the Athens airport with serene steps. She didn't know exactly where to go, but she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. It was the beginning of something vast. And even though she was alone, she didn't feel lonely. Solitude now was her choice. A quiet companion walking beside her without weight. Outside, the sun burned bright. The air carried another scent. She lifted her face to the breeze, inhaling deeply. It was real. She was here. No longer an attendant, no longer a caretaker, no longer a shadow. She was the protagonist of her own journey. The woman deemed too old to fly was now standing in a foreign land, with a light suitcase and a full heart. The pain still lingered, of course. You don't erase a lifetime of invisibility overnight. But it was no longer the center of her story. There was room now for joy, for rediscovery, for rebirth. And it all began here, with this solitary departure that, in truth, was the most powerful of all. The first thing she noticed stepping outside the airport was the warm, dry air embracing her like a soft blanket. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was welcoming. The city seemed to breathe history. Athens pulsed in every stone, every street corner, every curious gaze. She hailed a simple taxi and handed the driver the hotel's name scribbled on a piece of paper. It wasn't luxurious, nor did it need to be. It was clean, with a small balcony and a bed only for her. When she entered the room, she looked around and felt a mix of strangeness and freedom. For the first time in years, she was in a space that belonged to no one else. No pots waiting, no beds to be made for others. It was hers alone. And that had immeasurable value. She took a long shower, without rush. She let the water wash not just her skin but her soul. As if each drop rinsed away a bit of abandonment, of rejection, of the loneliness she had swallowed for years. She dried herself slowly, put on simple, comfortable clothes, and stepped outside to walk. The city was alive, and now she was part of it. She wandered aimlessly down cobblestone streets, feeling the ground beneath her feet, the scent of fresh bread, the sound of languages she didn't understand but that welcomed her anyway. It felt like stepping into an old dream, one she had kept folded in the drawer of her soul, believing it would never come true. But it was happening, under her tired but steady feet. She stopped at a small restaurant hidden in an alley. The waiter smiled, she pointed at a dish on the menu, and sat by the window. Alone. But not lonely. In fact, there was a new peace in that silence. Eating by herself, something that once would have felt sad, now was an act of autonomy. Every bite reminded her that she could nourish herself in body and in spirit without anyone's approval. She watched people pass by, imagining their stories, their destinations. And for the first time, she wasn't comparing herself to anyone. She didn't need to be like the others. She only needed to be whole. And there, between one bite and the next, she tasted something new: freedom. After lunch, she bought a postcard with an image of the Parthenon and walked back to the hotel with light steps. She sat on the balcony, took out a pen, and began to write. The words flowed in a way they hadn't in years. But she didn't write to her son. She wrote to her granddaughter, Amelia. I am in Athens. Alone. By choice. One day, you will understand the value of this. There was no bitterness in the ink, only truth. She knew her granddaughter was different. She listened. She had a sensitivity that contrasted with the emotional silence of her father. The postcard was more than a keepsake. It was a whisper of legacy. A way of saying, I am alive, and I am finding myself again. Maybe one day, you'll need to do the same. In the days that followed, she walked without a map, without plans. She visited ruins, tilted her head back and imagined voices of the past whispering among broken columns. There was something mystical in being there. As if every stone knew her story and welcomed her without judgment. On one of those outings, she sat before the sea and gazed at the horizon. She thought of everything she had left behind. But for the first time, she didn't feel guilt. The pain was still there. Yes, rejection doesn't dissolve overnight. But now it was no longer paralyzing. It was only a reminder of who she had been. And beside that pain, something new was blooming: a sense of belonging to herself. She stayed there by the water for a long time, letting the sea speak to her in its own language. The horizon stretched wide and endless, and for the first time in decades, she didn't feel small in front of it. She felt part of it. She thought of the family she had left behind, of the many times she had stayed in the shadows, and of all the silent sacrifices that no one ever noticed. And yet, sitting there with the wind tugging gently at her hair, she realized that life wasn't over. She wasn't finished. She was simply beginning again, this time with herself at the center. Every step she took in Athens became a declaration. When she wandered through narrow streets filled with flowers and street musicians, she felt music inside her own chest. When she stood in front of ruins older than any memory, she thought of her own history: scarred, cracked, but still standing. When she sat at a cafe and sipped bitter coffee, she savored not the taste, but the quiet certainty that she could now choose for herself. There was no rush. No obligations. Just presence. And that presence was a form of healing. In the quiet of the hotel room at night, she often thought of Amelia. She imagined her granddaughter one day reading that postcard and understanding that courage sometimes comes in small, silent rebellions. That sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is simply to choose herself. She didn't know if Amelia would ever face the same neglect she had faced, but if she did, she wanted her to remember there is always a way to begin again. There is always a way to claim your own name back. The days went by, and Athens became more than a city, it became a mirror. Each corner reflected a piece of her she thought was gone, her laughter, her curiosity, her hunger for life. She no longer walked like someone waiting for permission. She walked like someone who belonged, if not to the world, then at least to herself. And that belonging was enough. One afternoon, she climbed a hill and stood looking out at the Parthenon glowing golden in the sunset. The sky burned in shades of orange and pink, and tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, not of anger, but of recognition. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I am still here." Those words, simple as they were, carried the weight of everything she had lived and everything she had survived. They were her anthem, her vow, her proof. Because in the end, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about rebirth. About reclaiming the strength that had always been hers. About turning abandonment into freedom, rejection into autonomy, and pain into legacy. She had been treated as a shadow, but now she was walking in her own light. And maybe, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been left behind, you'll recognize yourself in her steps. You'll see that it's never too late to start again. That sometimes the most powerful journeys begin with a single act of quiet defiance. She didn't just take a trip. She took herself back. Every night, before falling asleep, she made small notes in a notebook. Nothing elaborate. Just scattered phrases, broken thoughts, whispered truths. It was like rebuilding herself word by word. She discovered there was so much left unsaid. Things she had silenced for decades. She realized she had lost her own voice in the middle of everyone else's demands. But now, every word she wrote was like stitching her soul back together. That quiet woman, erased by obligations, was being reborn. And rebirth has no glamour. It is slow, painful, but profoundly transformative. One afternoon, under an orange-tinged sky, she bought a small necklace with an owl-shaped pendant. The shopkeeper explained that in Greek mythology, the owl represents wisdom. She smiled. Not because she considered herself wise, but because she was finally beginning to listen to herself. And listening to yourself is a rare kind of wisdom. She would carry that symbol around her neck as a reminder that even after being disregarded, the woman she was still pulsed inside her. Perhaps stronger than ever. The pain of being invisible now shared space with the joy of being rediscovered. By her. For her. And it was with this lighter rhythm, with solitary walks and simple meals, that she began to build her new story. Without hurry, without an audience, without applause. Every step was a choice. Every choice, a declaration. The woman who had once been left behind was now going far. Not in distance, but in depth. She was retrieving forgotten layers, revisiting dreams left at the bottom of her soul. And all of it in silence. But this was a different silence now, not of exclusion, but of presence. And that card she had sent to Amelia? It was only the beginning of a new bond. One not based on obligations, but on truth. It was in a little corner cafe, tucked away from tourist traffic, that she saw Rosalie for the first time. Rosalie was sitting alone, a glass of white wine in hand, thick-framed glasses on, hair tied carelessly, and eyes staring across the street as if deciphering the world in silence. They exchanged brief glances, like two people recognizing the same kind of loneliness in each other. The next day, by chancer fate, they ended up seated close again. A comment about the heat was enough to open conversation. Rosalie replied with dry humor and a heavy French accent. "The only good heat is the one that comes with age, not from asphalt," she said without even smiling. Yet something about it made them both laugh. That was the beginning. The friendship was born effortlessly, like things that had been ready to bloom for a long time. They strolled the same streets, had coffee in the same corner, and shared silences that said more than words. Rosalie was a widow too, but she spoke of her husband the way one recalls an old friend, not with lament, but with respect. "We were good together until we weren't," she would say. She was direct, without detours, without sentimentality. And that was enchanting. In Rosalie, she saw a version of herself that might have existed if she had said no more often in life. If she had put herself at the center a little earlier. Rosalie was whole, yet not rigid. She carried a quiet joy, the kind that comes from a resistance well lived. They shared meals, laughed at hurried tourists, criticized bad coffee, and remembered their youth with the same bittersweet tone. Rosalie would say that aging was like gaining the right to be inconvenient without guilt. There comes a time when you either stay silent forever or you finally set yourself free. And it was right there, in those conversations, that she realized there was still time. Their friendship wasn't just companionship. It was a mirror, a provocation, a cure. Sharing space with another woman who also knew abandonment but had turned the tables was like finding a forgotten map inside herself. They went together to the flower market, the local bookstore, and a small fair where they tasted sticky Greek sweets that clung to their fingers and to memory. Each little experience was a reminder that life still had flavors to offer. The world was far from being only pain and disregard. On one of their walks, Rosalie spoke of her own daughter, who had chosen to cut ties. "She thinks I'm too hard. But I was only firm enough not to erase myself completely." She listened in silence, feeling each word land softly but sharply, like a quiet arrow. Their stories intertwined. And in that exchange, stripped of victimhood, she felt validated. For the first time in a long time. They began to see each other every day. Sometimes for hours, sometimes just for minutes. It didn't take much. The bond between them was an invisible thread, but a strong one. They spoke of everything: motherhood, loss, failed loves, ridiculous fears, desires still alive. Rosalie spoke with her eyes, and she learned from the silence. She discovered that freedom takes many forms, and sometimes it shows up in the muffled laughter between friends who have finally understood they don't need permission to exist anymore. This was a rare connection. It wasn't about filling voids, but about walking side by side with someone who recognized your scars. One afternoon, as they wandered aimlessly, Rosalie stopped in front of a fabric store and said, "We spend our lives stitching together the stories of others. But now it's time to embroider our own." She stayed quiet, staring at the vibrant colors in the window, her throat tightening. That was it. For the first time, she saw herself as someone with a voice, with color, with her own story. No longer the family's shadow, no longer the household's emotional caretaker. With Rosalie, she remembered what it was to be a woman beyond motherhood, beyond service, beyond the label of dear grandma. She was finally someone. It was Rosalie who suggested they go to Florence. "You need to see how art changes you from the inside," she said. And she, acting on an impulse that no longer felt strange, agreed. The next destination wasn't an escape, Anna Maria, it was an expansion. It wasn't a solitary trip now. It was a crossing made together. Two women, two pasts, one present shared. The suitcase would be small, but the emotional baggage was enormous. Anne finally acknowledged. The pain hadn't disappeared, but now it was accompanied by something new, the real possibility of joy regained. And that changed everything. The night before they left, they toasted with white wine at the same table where they had first met. To the ones left behind who decided to go anyway. The toast sounded like a silent manifesto. They laughed. Laughed at themselves, at life, at its late surprises. Yes, it was possible to begin again. And starting over at 70 wasn't madness. It was resistance. It was choice. It was rebirth. As she listened to Rosalie talk about the Uffizi Gallery, she thought, this woman entered my life the way someone enters a dark house and turns on the light. And now, with that light burning, It was impossible to go back to the darkness. The train ride to Florence was quiet, but heavy with meaning. She gazed out the window as if watching her past speed by in reverse. The rolling Tuscan hills drifted past gently, each one like an invitation to introspection. Rosalie slept beside her, a book resting on her lap, her head leaning softly against the glass. That image touched her deeply. It was so rare to see someone resting with such peace. She, too, felt her body relax for the first time in ages. It was as though layers of pain and invisibility were slowly being lifted, making room for something new. A lightness that didn't come from the destination, but from the decision to go. They arrived in Florence at golden dusk, the sky painted in watercolor hues. The city felt both ancient and vibrant at once. Every corner seemed to hide a story. They stayed in a modest inn, its walls covered in ivy, near the historic center. The owner was kind, offering them wine as a welcome, and she felt again that she was exactly where she needed to be. They dropped their bags in the room and, before even resting, went out to walk. The air carried the smell of pasta, the distant sound of a violin, the gentle warmth of a European summer. Florence seemed built to awaken those who had been asleep. At the first museum, standing before Michelangelo's David, she froze. Not because of the marble, but because of what it meant. It was proof that the human body, even aged, scarred, worn, still carries beauty, strength, and dignity. She thought of her own body. How many times had it been criticized, ignored, demanded of? And there, she embraced it. Not as it was at 20, but as it was now, resilient, loyal enough. That sculpture was not just art. It was a reminder that when truly seen, each of us has something monumental. She straightened too, even with her weary spine. For the first time, she walked the streets with less stoop in her shoulders. More alive. They went on visiting museums, churches, piazzas. But the most unforgettable moments weren't the masterpiece, it was the pauses. A strong coffee in a narrow alley. A conversation interrupted by laughter. The silence that required no explanation. The presence of the other was enough. Rosalie sometimes made sharp remarks about rushed tourists, and she laughed wholeheartedly. Laughed for real. Not the polite chuckle she gave when her grandchildren said something. It was a clean laugh, flavored with authenticity. And she realized something simple but powerful: she was learning to enjoy her own company again. To enjoy life again. She bought a silk scarf in a little hidden shop. Red, bold, almost defiant. Something she never would have worn before. But now, it felt natural. Like she wanted to shout without words, "I'm here. I still exist. I still feel." She draped the scarf lightly, and when she saw her reflection in the shop's mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not because she was ugly, but because she was different. More centered. More grounded. It was as if she were slowly rediscovering the woman she had been before being swallowed by the roles of mother, mother-in-law, grandmother. The woman who dreamed, who desired, who laughed loudly and made plans. On a cloudy afternoon, they sat on some stone steps, gelatos in hand. They said little. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was understanding. She looked up at the sky and thought of Paul. If he could see her now, what would he say? Maybe he'd smile, maybe he'd be surprised. Or maybe he'd finally recognize the woman he always said lived inside her, but whom she herself couldn't see. It was strange, this feeling of rebirth happening so quietly, without screams, without grand ruptures. Just small decisions, made with steady courage. Like someone who stops waiting and begins to live. At night in Florence, she looked through the photos taken that day. But it wasn't the images that mattered most. It was the feeling left behind. The sensation of belonging. Of not needing to prove anything to anyone. That city was stirring something deep inside her, a desire to go on. Not as a survivor, but as a protagonist. It was more than resistance. It was pleasure. And that was new. She was rediscovering the taste for details, for slow walks, for unhurried conversations. And that rediscovery carried the rarest flavor of all: freedom that no one could take away. And so, between paintings, sculptures, conversations, and shared silences, she realized she was no longer the same. Something had shifted in the way she walked, in the way she looked clerks in the eye, in how she occupied space. She was no longer the woman waiting by the door in her apron while others traveled. Now she was the one going. And she no longer needed justification. She was being reborn. And this rebirth was subtle, yet overwhelming. Florence had given her more than beautiful memories. It had given her a mirror. It had given her color. It had given her herself back. It was on a calm afternoon, sipping tea on a balcony overlooking the Arno, that her phone buzzed for the first time. A familiar number, but unexpected. It was her son. The screen flashed as if it were an alarm, perhaps a reminder of a world she had stepped away from. She didn't answer. She watched the number until it disappeared. Then the messages came. Long, hurried, full of question marks. Where are you? Are you okay? Why did you do this? Not once did he write an apology. Only a flustered concern. That kind of discomfort that arises when the structure that sustained someone's comfort begins to crumble. Rosalie glanced at the messages over her shoulder and remarked, with ironic calm, now that you stepped away from your role, they don't know how to live without their emotional maid. She laughed, a blend of hurt and relief. It wasn't bitterness she felt. It was clarity. For the first time, she saw her son not as a victim of exhaustion or busyness, but as an active part of the system that had kept her small, useful, invisible. The messages kept coming, some trying to use the granddaughter as a bridge, others dripping with disguised guilt. We never meant to leave you out. Things were just so rushed. We thought you wanted to stay. She read them all in silence, with a calm she never used to have. She didn't reply. Not out of spite, but out of autonomy. Her silence was not absence, but choice. It was her way of saying, now, I speak with actions. She decided she would only respond when she was ready, not when they expected her to. Rosalie affirmed the thought, those who pushed you down to the footnotes now miss you because you vanished from their story. That line echoed in her mind. Yes, she had vanished, but by her own will. And that was what unsettled them. The woman who always said, it's fine, I'll take care of it, was now saying, not today, not anymore. And that was revolutionary. Deep down, she knew what disturbed her son most wasn't her whereabouts, but his lost control. For the first time, he didn't know where she was, what she was doing, who she was with. The predictable grandmother, waiting at home with dinner ready, was now a woman walking through Renaissance museums and learning to like herself. It was a kind of disobedience that bruised his ego, not his heart. And still, she felt no guilt. Because for the first time, she understood that caring for herself was also an act of love. Self-love. And that, she realized, had to be urgent. Her daughter-in-law also wrote. A message layered with empty compliments and shallow attempts at reconciliation. You've always been important to us. We miss you. We want you to come back soon. But not once was there acknowledgement of the hurt caused, the habitual disregard, the absence of genuine affection. They were words sent in haste, not born of care. And as she read them with steady eyes, she knew she didn't want to go back to her old role. She wanted Anne Deservetto be treated as whole. And so, it wasn't time to return. Not as before. She began walking more, filling her days with things that once seemed far away. She painted small watercolors in her notebook, tasted different foods, wrote down thoughts about each city, each feeling. And gradually, contact with her family stopped being urgent. It was like healing an old wound. It itched, sometimes bled, but no longer hurt the same way. The space they held inside her still existed, but it no longer dominated her. She realized she could love them without allowing them to shrink her. And that realization was a kind of liberation she had never imagined possible. One day, after reading yet another message full of persuasion, she typed a single reply. Direct. Without anger. But firm. I'm fine. If you want me back, it will be as a whole person. Not as a shadow. She sent it, took a deep breath, turned off the phone, and went out for a walk. It was late afternoon. The golden light of the city illuminated her hands, her steps, her story. And she walked lightly, even knowing not everyone would understand what that meant. Courage has that side effect: it frees you, but unsettles those who profited from your captivity. The confrontation had come, yes. But not with shouts, not with fights. With quiet truths. With presence. With refusal to step back into the imposed role. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wanted only respect. To be heard. To be seen. And if that meant pulling further away, so be it. True love does not demand submission. It does not impose silence. Now she knew this. And because she knew, she would never again negotiate her integrity. If a reunion ever happened, it would have to be on new terms. Otherwise, she'd rather keep moving. Because better solitude that respects you than company that erases you. Lisbon was melancholy dressed in sunlight. The moment her feet touched its stone streets, she felt Fathu stirring inside her. That music, both sorrowful and beautiful, seemed to sing her story. In a small restaurant, listening to her first live Fathu, she let slip a tear she had been holding for months. The pain had now become sound. And understanding that was like breathing again after being submerged too long. The surprise came when Rosalie fell ill. Nothing too serious, but enough that she needed care. And in that moment, she understood what she had never known how to name when care is chosen: it is light. At her friend's side, she wasn't exploited, she was present. The experience healed something inside her. Caring could be beautiful, as long as it didn't erase her. As long as it was mutual. It was during this interval of tenderness that she decided to write to her son. Not in submission, but in truth. The message was clear: if you want me back, it will be as a whole person, not as a shadow. She didn't apologize. She didn't justify. She simply stated. Because once you discover your strength, you no longer negotiate your presence. In Lisbon, she realized freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's having the courage not to return to what shrinks you. And that courage now lived inside her. Seville was fire. Dance. Intensity. On the very first day, she watched a flamenco performance in a closed courtyard, and there she witnessed something unforgettable: a dancer older than herself, face lined with deep wrinkles, stomping against the floor as if defying time itself. It gave her chills. It was more than art. It was a message. The next day, she joined a beginner's class. She trembled inside, but she went. Her steps were clumsy, but they were true. Each strike against the wooden floor was a scream she had swallowed for years. By the end, sweaty and smiling, she felt something new: joy. Not the kind of joy she gave to others. Her own. Recovered, whole, alive. The woman who once asked permission to exist was now stomping out rhythms without apology. The dance wasn't a performance. It was a rebirth. And finally, she was dancing for herself. The return home was quiet but decisive. No announcement, no party. She walked through the front door as someone who had returned to the same place with a different spirit. The house was the same, but she was not. She moved through the rooms with a steady gaze. There was no bitterness anymore, no longing for that time when she was forgotten in the middle of her family's routines. Now, each space was simply that space. And she finally knew how to occupy it without disappearing. She brewed some tea and sat on the porch. She opened her notebook and reread her own words. Those phrases, written in different cities, now formed a complete portrait of the woman she had become. It was like rereading her own reconstruction. Not a diary of laments, but a map of liberation. Closing the notebook, she smiled. She knew she would never again return to the role that suffocated her. Her son came on the third day. He brought flowers and a speech dripping with guilt. He tried to explain, to justify, to soothe. But she wasn't looking for automatic reconciliation. She said calmly, "I didn't vanish. I found myself again." He hesitated, confused. The mother who had always said yes was now drawing boundaries. The one who was always available was now choosing who received her presence. And that, he hadn't expected. Her daughter-in-law watched silently, maybe hoping everything would go back to normal. But she was clear: if you want my presence, it will be as a whole person. I will not go back to being a shadow. There was no anger in her voice. Only clarity. The freedom she had claimed no longer fit within the walls of submission. Amelia, on the other hand, was blooming. She called, she wrote, she asked for advice, she shared her own writings. It was like watching inherited courage sprout in another body. One afternoon, sitting side by side, her granddaughter said, "Grandma, you taught me that we get to choose our own place in the world." And that was enough. The silence of her son no longer hurt as much. What mattered was right there, in front of her, a living legacy, respected and carried forward. Now she went out alone, laughed alone, spoke her thoughts out loud. She had plans, even if small ones. She had peace. And above all, she had a voice. The woman who had once been forgotten was now a reference, not by demand, but by example. On the last page of her notebook, she wrote, "I was never too old. No one ever asked if I still dreamed. Now, I don't wait to be asked. I go." She closed the notebook firmly. She knew her story didn't end there, it was only just beginning. And no one would ever again erase who she had become. Yes, she had been forgotten. Ignored, pushed aside, discarded, as if time had steamrolled over her dreams and erased any trace of desire. But instead of shrinking under that abandonment, she chose to rise. She chose to leave without noise, without revenge, without explanations. Only with the courage of someone who understands that life still pulses even when no one else believes it. This is not just a story of travel. It is a crossing. An emotional crossing of someone who had been treated as a utility and returned as a presence. Who left invisible and came back whole. Who stopped waiting for approval and never again apologized for choosing herself. And maybe you are standing at that very same point where it still hurts, where courage is still missing, where everything feels too late. But it is never too late. That woman, perhaps so much like you, shows that liberation doesn't come with fireworks. It comes in silence. It comes when you start saying no without guilt. When you decide to carry less resentment and more truth. When you stop waiting for someone to notice you and you begin noticing yourself first. And if you recognized yourself here, if something inside you vibrated differently while reading this, then now it is your turn. Comment below, "Now I go." That phrase, simple yet powerful, could be the start of your own turning point. A silent pact between you and your new self. And if you want to go further, share your story, listen to others, be part of a community of women who chose to find themselves again, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Not to follow just another piece of content, but to follow yourself firmly. Because what this story delivers is not a formula. It is permission. The permission no one ever gave you, but that now you can give yourself. And here lies the true legacy, not in the things we leave behind, but in the truths we dare to live. In the example we hand forward, like a seed planted in time. That's what she did. With small steps, steady, silent but irreversible. Her granddaughter inherited her courage. And maybe someone near you needs to inherit yours too. Not through pretty words, but through your example of resistance, of truth, of autonomy. Through you standing tall and saying, "Now it's my turn." She had been discarded. And she chose not to take revenge, but to transform. She had been left aside, and instead of waiting for an invitation, she created her own path. And when she returned, she brought back more than memories. She brought identity. She brought back a complete woman. She brought back a grandmother who had become a symbol. Not by force, but by choice. Because in the end, it is not about who left you. It is about what you do afterward. And if you've made it this far, if you are still reading these words, maybe it's because you are ready to go too. So go. Without fear, without asking permission, without waiting. Because being forgotten is painful. But becoming unforgettable, that is your right.